which is Senate Bill 34, for its second hearing. Senator Jordan's bill. And the first witness we have today is Kevon Martis from Riga, Michigan, representing the Interstate Informed Citizens Coalition. Welcome back, Mr. Martis. We're glad to have you.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Seitz, Vice Chairman LaRose, and Ranking Member Kearney, and members of the committee, my name is Kevon Martis. I am the Volunteer Director of the Interstate Informed Citizens Coalition of Blissfield, Michigan. We're a bipartisan renewable energy citizens advocacy group. In my role as Director of the IICC, I speak on behalf of the hundreds of citizens in Ohio who are living in the front lines of industrial wind development. That is a direct result of SB 221. I speak today in support, of course, of SB 34. State-level renewable energy mandates like SB 221 were enacted at a time when natural gas was expensive and projected to decline, with cap-and-trade schemes looming on the federal horizon and non-emitting and fuel-price stable nuclear forced to the backbench by green activists. There was apparent wisdom in leading a drive to advanced energy generation. It is a far different story today. Formerly considered a no-brainer, one-size-fits-all wind energy mandates are fast falling out of favor across the political spectrum. Once the darling of the press, extension of the federal production tax credit for wind was recently opposed by the editorial boards of the Chicago Tribune and the Washington Post. Huffington Post is running articles that point out the ill effects of wind energy, and in Ohio, traditionally left-leaning environmental groups like the American Bird Conservancy and the Black Swamp Bird Observatory are threatening litigation against wind development near the Lake Erie shoreline. And the economic calamity brought about by renewable energy mandates are even driving the European Union off the mandate bandwagon. Further, the curtain of secrecy is being pulled back to reveal the dangerous nexus of the ideologically driven PR groups like Sierra Club and the federal regulatory entities like the EPA. Just last week, it was discovered via FOIA requests that EPA and Sierra Club maintain a very cozy relationship indeed. How cozy? Quoting from a recent article, Nancy Grantham, Director of the Public Affairs for EPA Region 1, which covers New England, asked an organizer for the Sierra Club's New Hampshire chapter to share the group's agenda so EPA could adjust its message accordingly, saying, quote, "If you could, it would be great if you can send me an email describing what you would like to do in early April in New Hampshire. That way I can coordinate messaging with our air offices here and at HQ." Imagine the United States Environmental Protection Agency adjusted their messaging to suit the needs of the Sierra Club. The regulatory revolving door is in full spin, and a quick glance at the OEA's 2011 policy document reveals that they are likewise connected at the hip to Sierra Club and the other environmental groups. It also reveals that Republican legislators were targeted by the trade group for their support, and OEA was in large part successful in garnering those conservative legislators' support for wind energy mandates. What does this mean for us today? Put bluntly, to support continuation of renewable energy mandates like SB 221 is to play into the hands of Sierra, Natural Resource Defense Council, Ohio Environmental Council, Environmental Defense Fund, the Union of Concerned Scientists, and their marketing partners, the American Wind Energy Association, as well as the U.S. EPA. And the agenda of these groups could not be clearer. They wish to bring about the demise of 80% of Ohio's generation portfolio, coal. And with coal goes the affordable energy-dependent manufacturing jobs that have been the backbone of Ohio's economy for generations. Now let me be clear, I am no particular friend of gas, oil, coal, nuclear, or the monopoly utilities. But the fact remains, the stakeholders working against this RPS repeal measure have something much larger in mind than simply adding some wind generation to Ohio's generation portfolio. And I am not alone in this opinion. Exelon, the U.S. largest nuclear operator and a substantial wind developer, is only the first major power generator to have peeked behind the OEA Sierra Club curtain and begun to oppose wind energy subsidies. In fact, it cost them their position on OEA's board of directors. One wonders if AEP can be far behind. Now let me quickly enumerate a few points about SB 221 and why it needs to be repealed. First of all, if the purpose of SB 221 was to replace coal generation, it could hardly be a bigger failure. 6 years after its adoption, Ohio still generates 80% of its electricity from coal, 10% from gas, and the rest from nuclear. Despite nearly $750 million in wind development in Ohio, wind penetration remains below 1%, or an annualized and paltry effective annual output of only 84 megawatts. This same sum spent on combined cycle gas generators would yield a capacity of 750 megawatts nearly 9 times as much, and could have significantly reduced CO2, fine particulate mercury emissions already. But the environmental benefit of the turbines in Paulding and Van Wert counties today is essentially zero. 2, Ohio wind energy is very expensive relative to its prairie states peers. Although Ohio does not publish the details of its wind energy power purchase agreements, Michigan does. We know that Ohio's wind resource is similar to Michigan's. It's marginal. By extrapolation, it's reasonable to conclude that Ohio wind, like Michigan, is costing well over $100 per megawatt hour to generate, yet can save only the cost of some fossil fuel, which is only worth 25 to 35 bucks a megawatt hour. That is a bad deal for ratepayers. Worse, wind generation is sharply inverse to demand. This means that this already expensive energy is arriving on the grid when it is of least value. 3, Ohio wind, like Michigan wind, is anemic. As a result, both states must construct low wind resource turbines. These turbines come with a pronounced price premium. Michigan's published installed cost for wind turbines varies between $2,200 and $2,500 a kilowatt of nameplate capacity. Iowa's latest installed cost is only $1,650. In a nutshell, it costs nearly 50% more per kilowatt to build Ohio turbines that then harvest a wind resource with 50% less potential energy. Continuing an Ohio wind mandate is to mandate ever higher percentages of uncompetitive energy that typically arrives on the grid at times of lowest value. 4, SB 221's in-state generation mandate is an unconstitutional infringement upon your ratepayers' constitutional right to unfettered interstate commerce. It is analogous to Michigan restricting the importation of Toledo-produced Jeep vehicles or Marysville-built Hondas. 5, under pending EPA regulations, Ohio may very well face a baseload generation shortage. Unfortunately, wind and solar are not one-to-one replacements for baseload generators. Thus, if SB 221 is not repealed, Ohio ratepayers could soon be faced with the prospect of having to push 2 shopping carts down the aisle at the same time. One to be filled with new gas-fired generation to replace the dispatchable capacity of EPA-induced coal plant closures, and the other with wind and solar. Unfortunately, the fact that heavily subsidized wind and solar parasitize the revenue stream of gas-fired generation makes it much more difficult to recover the cost of constructing and operating those new gas plants. And when one understands that adding wind to combined cycle gas generation is 9 times more expensive per ton of CO2 avoided compared to simply replacing coal with combined cycle gas, everyone, including those whose first priority is ever cleaner and cooler air and water, must question the wisdom of this burden as well. And finally, and I am choosing my words deliberately here, SB 221 has created pandemonium and terror in Ohio's rural communities. Lawsuits, conflicts of interest among elected and appointed officials, abandoned homes, and devastated social relationships have become the grim reality inside Ohio's proposed or operating wind plants. This is due to the disparity between those who host a turbine on their land with compensation and those whose land is being used as a safety and nuisance abatement zone with neither consent or compensation via appropriation by the State Power Siting Board. If it is true that all generation projects have an adverse impact on nearby residential values, then we need only look at the capacity density of impacted land with wind compared to dispatchable and dependable nuclear, coal, or gas generation to understand why this issue is more prevalent with wind. When you adjust for capacity factors, you cover 1,000 times more land with wind than you would with coal, gas, and nuclear. In conclusion, in simple terms, and I say this as a building contractor, mandating and subsidizing wind energy is like hiring one of my teenage sons to work in my construction business. They are seldom there when there is real work to be done. When they do show up, they have a highly inflated opinion of their relative contribution to the task at hand. Nevertheless, they demand to be paid far more than their adult co-workers for their juvenile efforts, and they then reward you by keeping you up all night with incessant and annoying noise that you are absolutely powerless to stop. On the behalf of those who are needlessly bearing the burden of Ohio's unconstitutional, ineffectual renewable energy mandate, I wholeheartedly endorse SB 34.
Thank you, Mr. Martis. We appreciate your testimony. I think that testimony is in everyone's packet, is that right?
Yeah.
I have one question. I read somewhere recently that the state of Michigan has released a draft report, and what, if anything, did that draft report have to say about the wind mandate that Judge Posner had described as an insurmountable constitutional obstacle in his 2013 decision?
Certainly. The governor had 7 meetings around the state, asked all the various stakeholders to give comment on energy policy over the past year. And a number of interesting findings came out of that report. One is, as you had suggested, the governor's office believes the in-state generation mandate to be unconstitutional. Secondly, it recommended that turbine sightings be, setback distances be pushed out to about 1.25 miles instead of only 1,000 feet. It recommended that the noise levels be reduced below 40 decibels. It also conceded that Michigan wind energy is quite expensive and that there can be ill health effects associated with renewable energy. I believe, in my conversations with legislators in Lansing, Michigan will no longer continue with a percentage renewable energy mandate. They recognize, as you certainly recognize here, the biggest threat to your generation portfolio in Ohio is the constant changes of regulation brought about by the EPA. Therefore, a policy with maximum flexibility is the wisest for the people of Michigan. I certainly recommend that here as well.
Thank you. Senator Kearney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Martis, that's the correct pronunciation.
Yes.
I have a couple of questions. You spent most of your time on wind, but do you have objections to solar, the thermo, the hydro, these other renewable sources as well?
No, I'm not anti-renewable by any stretch. I mean, consider the state of Ohio. They have 75% hydroelectric, and their electricity is 8 cents a kilowatt hour. I wish Ohio and Michigan had that. That's fantastic. Ohio doesn't have those resources. Likewise, we don't have adequate wind resources to compete with Iowa. I would very much like to see distributed solar work for people's homes and businesses so that you could sever a grid connection. I lean free market. That would be a fantastic way to create real competition in the energy marketplace if you could actually produce your own energy at home. So I'm very much in favor of that, but the economics and the science of industrial scale wind is not effective, yet it is the default type of generation being constructed as a result of these mandates.
Senator, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Martis, so you bring up a good point in answering my first question. What do you say to people who say that wind is we're in the early stages of its development? If we invest money in it now, 20 years from now, it may be all the rage and it may be a lower cost.
Sure. Sure, I'm familiar with the question. The thing that would make solar and wind a fair and valuable contributor to our energy generation portfolio would be storage, so that you could take that energy from the times when it's produced, for instance, wind primarily at times of low demand, and shift its output to times of high demand. Unfortunately, the way the federal production tax credit is structured, there is no incentive to build storage at all. The federal production tax credit pays $23 a megawatt hour, and there is no penalty to wind operators for producing that in the middle of the night and dumping it into the grid when there's no demand. So there is no market structure in place right now to incentivize the construction of storage whatsoever. That's a huge flaw in our federal energy policy.
Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Mr. Martis, this I think is my final question. Have you done any research, or do you have any knowledge about the jobs associated with wind energy? Because what I have been told is that Ohio has a lot of workers who are very good at building things, and that Ohio benefits from the wind industry, not only from the energy that's put on the grid, but also because we have people who are working and there are a lot of jobs created and we're building a lot of turbines.
Sure. Well, there's several ways to respond to that. One is the old story that Milton Friedman, the economist, talked about, where he saw that irrigation canals being dug in the desert by men with shovels, and he said, why are you using shovels instead of excavation equipment? And he said, well, because shovels create more jobs. He said, well, then why don't you compel them to dig with teaspoons? So there's a certain inherent efficiency issue here. But with respect to jobs, the Steel Manufacturers Association reports that they use $18 billion a year of electricity in the United States to produce steel. $18 billion. That's significant. Just a 10% increase in the cost of electricity to the steel manufacturers would be a $1.8 billion per year surcharge. They have 100,000 employees, perhaps a little less now, largely union employees. A 10% increase in the price of electricity to that steel manufacturing industry results in $18,000 a year per employee no longer available for wages, fringes, and benefits. So it is not a zero-sum matter. And when Ohio wind is costing maybe 80 bucks a megawatt hour to generate, or is being sold for that, it costs well over $100 to generate, and the wholesale value of that energy is only $35 on the open grid, the higher percentage of that expensive energy, the higher your utility costs will spike, and the bigger collateral damage to your energy-intensive industries.
Mr. Martis, I'm going to follow up on one of Senator Kearney's questions. He posited the theory that wind may not be terribly efficient now, but given continued technological advances, it may prove so in the future. And I believe you indicated that, yeah, if they ever figure out a good way to store it, it might work. But isn't it true, I'm looking here at an article from the TraverseTicker.com that I just received on Monday, and the Traverse City Light and Power's first wind turbine has sat idle since August 2012 after mechanical failures, attempts to replace the broken motors, multiple consults, and a staff recommendation. Traverse City Light and Power has given up and is now in the process of issuing an RFP for decommission and removal. And they quote the Traverse City Light and Power's Marketing and Community Relations Director as follows: "The turbine has been operational for 18 years and is now nearing the expected industry standard life of 20 years, said Jessica Wheaton. And I guess my question is, even assuming that 20 years down the line, we might suddenly find that this is effective, isn't it correspondingly then stupid to install them now if they have an installation life of 20 years? Why don't we wait 20 years and start installing them when the technology reaches the technologically advanced state that you posit might someday occur?"
I've made that argument myself in the past. I do concur with that. Understand that federal EIA uses a 30-year expected lifespan for wind turbines when they do their levelized cost of energy calculations, yet we know that they're struggling to reach 20 years. You're correct. I mean, the technology, put it in this perspective. I know in Michigan, because I do a lot of calculations there, it would take $28 billion worth of wind turbines to generate 25% of our electricity. Except every 20 years, you'd have to spend that $28 billion again. It would not prevent you from also having to simultaneously operate massive, identical quantities of gas generation that does not have to be replaced every 20 years. $28 billion worth of wind would replace most of the coal-fired generation in Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. So even if you're a rabid environmentalist, you have to say, why would we spend this much on wind when we could eliminate fine particulate and mercury emissions in most of the Midwest by building combined cycle gas while slashing CO2 by 50%? And EIA concedes the energy from combined cycle is just flat out cheaper and of more value than wind. I agree.
And isn't it also true that, to put this in perspective, if the life cycle for wind turbines is 20 years, or maybe if you indulge the EIA's exaggerated estimates, 30, how does that compare, for example, to hydro, nuclear, coal, and combined cycle? Aren't all of those technologies have a substantially longer life?
They do indeed, there's no question. And if you want to do just a raw materials comparison between wind and nuclear, over a 60-year lifetime, per megawatt of nameplate capacity, of actual generation, per megawatt hour generated, wind consumes 27 times more steel than a nuclear plant. So yes, there's tremendous inefficiencies that you have struggled to. The only answer to make wind more efficient is to continue to do what they've done, which is build bigger and bigger and bigger rotors, and in Michigan and Ohio, they put them on very small generators. It's to the point of being preposterous.
Senator Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and first I'd like to commend you for identifying really good witnesses, Mr. Chairman, to bring before the committee, and Mr. Martis, I appreciate your testimony very much, and think that it's extremely clear and in its analysis. So I guess my question through the chair is, we established in Senate Bill 221 the mandates based on factors that we believe that were true and believed to remain true for a long period of time. And so now as we enter into this discussion to try to unwind this, when our assumptions were false and the environment that was true actually did change. One of the criticisms we always hear when we enter into this discussion is, well, like it or not, you all have created these cottage industries that would not have existed but for the mandates you put in place. How would you respond to that?
I would say that those industries need to be mature, like my construction business, and risk their own capital and their own money and figure out a way to survive the vagaries of the business cycle like I have for the last 5 or 6 years. I'm not able to go back and ask for financial support or federal bailouts for my construction business. It's true, there is some collateral damage, but understand, wind is less than 1% of Ohio's generating portfolio right now. It's better to stop now than to get 20 or 30% installed. What you're really saying is, if we could assemble a room full of people who possess the gift of omniscience, then perhaps it would be wise to project 30 years into the future what's going to take place and then mandate the appropriate portfolio. But you would have to know ahead of time what's going to happen with nuclear, what's going to happen with gas, what's going to happen with coal, what's going to happen with renewables, and presume that we can sit in a room like this today and make a reasonable guess about the future. I think that's why Michigan has wisely leaned in the direction of saying the EPA could change with the next presidential election. We don't know what's coming next. Do we want to be locked into dead-end technologies that become irrelevant with every change of administration? Flexibility, I think, is key.
Mr. Chairman, a follow-up? So, you know, I certainly am empathetic to those who see, you know, jobs being created in these cottage industries. Do you think it's fair for us to consider then what the establishment is in terms of magnitude of those cottage industries versus the existing industry that exists in the state and the relative costs of increases in electricity for paying for those cottage industries?
The more you force your ratepayers to buy subsidized and mandated energy sources like wind and solar, the more the revenue stream that your baseload nuclear, gas, and coal generators require to pay off and support their massive capital investments, the more you steal from them, the less feasible it is for them to maintain and operate those plants. Or if the EPA forces you to close a number of those coal plants, what will you replace them with? That's an issue because wind and solar can't replace coal, gas, and nuclear on their own. If you close your coal and nuclear plants, you would have to build gas and wind. You can't just build wind. So it parasitizes the critical revenue stream that those plants need to be viable for the long term. So it's not a zero-sum game. We've seen in Michigan that as some of these wind mandates roll out, you build new infrastructure projects, your wind plant will create 2 to 3 jobs theoretically, while we close a satellite coal plant where you lost 30 or 40 jobs. I mean, I don't believe that there's a net jobs gain from green mandates at all. The JEDI modeling and so forth that they use to analyze these things only looks at jobs added and never asks what other jobs are lost elsewhere in the economy.
One follow-up, Mr. Chairman, thank you. And so I understand the comparison you're making in direct jobs, those who are working in coal plants or nuclear plants versus those who might be working on a wind farm once construction is, you have to consider when construction's finished on both of those, what remains. But I guess then my question would be, those then purchasers of the electricity, should we be considering then the impact on the purchasers of the electricity who are, employing and hiring folks compared to those jobs in these cottage industries?
Well, of course, but I would also say be very careful about numbers that are trumpeted by promoters of renewable energy in your state as far as jobs claims. We discovered in Michigan, our Bureau of Labor Statistics, or whatever it's called in the state of Michigan, looks at all these various sectors of employment. And as the green promoters are saying we've created 10, 20, 30,000 green jobs in the state of Michigan through this mandate, you look at that sector of employment over the last 10 years and the total employment has dropped. When you're recategorized, if you have a hardware business that furnishes fasteners for 1,000 industries but occasionally sells them to a wind operator, suddenly that's reclassified as a wind job. I doubt that man or woman will be laid off without the green mandate. So I'm just dubious of most of these claims in the first place, but if they don't look at the jobs lost as a result of capital being forced in a place in which it otherwise would not have gone, then I'm just very skeptical of them in the first place.
Mr. Chairman, can I just follow up on that analogy? Because it's an interesting one that you used about a fastener company. I guess my next question would be, so thinking about that analogy then, if you are making fasteners in the state of Ohio and the cost of your generation for electricity to make those fasteners is increased as a result of supporting this cottage industry of some amount of jobs that may or may not exist, should we consider then what the impacts of the higher electricity bills would be to that manufacturer, even if they aren't classifying jobs within that manufacturer as being wind jobs?
Of course. At some point, high enough penetrations of renewable energy end up sawing off the plank you're standing on, even if you're making parts for that industry, because it's a global industry. A lot of wind turbines are being constructed in China now, yet China has tremendous volumes of cheap coal generation coming online. So if they're able to make these parts really cheaply, as we've seen in the solar industry, while we're mandating very expensive forms of energy, at some point we're going to kill off our own native green energy business.
Senator Cole.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and there are two, it's always good to see you again, sir, and there's two items that I wanted to touch base with you on relative to the jobs issue. In your experience in Michigan, of course, when you're building wind energy for one, solar being another, yet, as you pointed out, you have to have a combined cycle gas and things. Did you experience a situation where they were counting the people that worked on the combined cycle gas plant as green energy jobs because you couldn't have the green energy without the combined cycle? Did you find that to be the case?
No, those are not counted in that fashion, to the best of my knowledge. And Michigan is in the process of permitting a new combined cycle plant. And Detroit Edison said that's because of the variance in the wind output in the thumb area, that they needed just additional flexible capacity to balance that out. So despite AWEA statements, for instance, that wind does not need gas generation to make it viable, it absolutely does in Michigan.
And then on the investment, I always thought, when I made an investment, then I would get to reap the benefits from that investment. And yet, while we're requiring Ohio consumers to come in and pay for this technology that doesn't really get the job done right now, if and when 20 years from now, as the chairman indicated, something were to break and some technological breakthrough would occur, how would Ohio consumers benefit from all that investment they've made for all these many years? Wouldn't the benefits of the technological breakthrough just continue to flow through to the wind energy companies?
Well, you've identified a critical point of concern here, is that wind is paired with fossil fuel generation, essentially gas generation. So the assumption of wind energy promoters essentially is that only wind technology advances while all the others apparently remain in steady state. Because wind is tied to fossil, if you get to very high penetrations of wind, you're going to be tied to fossil fuel. What happens if we get a breakthrough in modular thorium reactors? What happens if fuel cells suddenly become incredibly viable? You have now forced massive capital investment into an obsolescing technology that's just a dead end. So I think you're hitting exactly the right themes. Again, who says only wind and solar are going to be the long-term solution? It was only 180 years ago that steam was a novelty. I mean, these things happen all the time.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr.
Senator Eklund.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Martis. If, in fact, as you suggest, we should be skeptical of the job creation projections that the renewable energy industry proposes to us, help us understand why we should not be equally skeptical of the chicken littles in the rest of the industry who profess that, you know, they're going to lose all kinds of jobs because of these renewable energy mandates?
I would suggest a healthy dose of skepticism across the board. I mean, I hope that the people that I'm here with today are unique and that we don't have a dog in this fight except we're the people that live on the receiving end of these mandates. I'm not here asking for a carve-out for my industry. I'm not asking for a mandate. I'm simply coming from the perspective of a simple ratepayer saying, you know, the emperor has no clothes. So you're right, I would be skeptical on all sides. But we do know that in Michigan, they're looking very aggressively at ways to find a way to generate electricity more cheaply than Ohio, because they know there's a regional advantage there. And Ohio, I'm sure, is doing the same thing. And both of us are more expensive than many of our competitors in the Midwest, because a half-cent a kilowatt hour is the difference between having an energy-intensive business in your state or not. So I do know that high energy costs have a direct result on traditional manufacturing jobs, which has been the heartbeat of the Midwest for a generation.
May I, Chairman? Thank you for that. The other comment you just made was about, you know, what if this technology comes online in 2 years, or that technology comes online in 2 years? So why invest all this money in wind when something wonderful may happen in the near future? Wouldn't the same sort of reasoning have applied to, say, Alexander Graham Bell or Thomas Edison? You know, why invent the telephone when one of these gizmos is just around the corner, or why invent an incandescent light when an LCD light is just around the corner? And doesn't that sort of thinking impede the great thinkers in their efforts to innovate?
Well, sure, I understand what you're saying. I mean, it was clear in 1880 or 1885, as the telephone was invented, that it was a radical improvement over the Pony Express. And all that remained was to get this obviously superior technology deployed to as many people as soon as possible, because the cost savings were real and apparent to everybody. So we know what we need in electricity: clean, cheap, reliable, and abundant. Wind is none of those things, and solar are none of those things. That's the real problem. So we're trying to pour money into something to hopefully add to it attributes that it does not inherently possess. Whereas in the case of the telephone, the inherent abilities of telephone were already real and pronounced, and Alexander Graham Bell saw a market opportunity to make himself very wealthy by creating something that's a huge need, and is satisfied that has worked very well for well over a century. So there's a big difference between pouring money into for instance, if you want to ask me where should we redirect wind mandates, we know that natural gas being consumed in automobiles is far cheaper than gasoline and far cleaner. What are we missing? The delivery infrastructure to put natural gas into our vehicles. I could support some policies that incentivize that, because I think the latest numbers on the gasoline equivalent cost like $1.87 versus $3.50 at the pump for gas. That's an obvious and natural benefit to everybody with a proven technology. That's far different than pouring money into essentially what we're saying is we're constructing billions of dollars worth of prototype wind in the state of Ohio and Michigan in the hope that someday that investment pays off. I think Senator Seitz is correct. Iowa's building them at $1,650 a kilowatt. We're building them at well over $2,000. Let's let Iowa get those down to $500. Then if we want to roll the dice, it would make a lot more sense.
And following up, if I might, on Senator Eklund's last question, isn't there another signal difference between what's going on here and what's going on with Alexander Graham Bell and Thomas Alva Edison, which is, to my knowledge, the 50 states did not mandate that ratepayers pay so that everybody would buy Alexander Graham Bell's phone, nor did they mandate that everybody buy Thomas Alva Edison's light bulbs. They worked, and therefore the free market worked, and therefore the people went out and bought them because they worked. It was not some Stalinist government mandating, you will buy my stuff. Isn't that a big difference between that technological curve and the one that we're faced with now?
I might phrase it more gently. But
I don't believe in general.
Look, we know what this mandate is about. Senator Seitz asked a question of the gentleman from Iberdrola Renewables when we were looking at the last bill. And the question was addressed to this man: without this in-state generation mandate, will you be able to continue to build and operate wind in the state of Ohio? And he said it would be very challenging. Why? Because you can buy Iowa wind to fulfill your mandate for $30 and it's costing ratepayers 60, 70, 80 bucks a megawatt hour to add it here. Even if you like the green benefits, you have to question the wisdom of paying 2.5 times what something like that is worth. If you really want the best bang for your buck, like the National Academy of Sciences said with respect to CO2 emissions, the production tax credit is a massively expensive way to avoid CO2 if that's your demon du jour.
Other questions from members of the committee? Seeing none, thank you very much, Mr. Martis, for your testimony. Before we go to the next witness, we do have a fresh copy of the minutes in front of the members, the minutes of our meeting of November 13th. They have been distributed, correct? Are there any corrections or comments with respect to the minutes? Seeing none, the minutes stand approved. While we're also calling up our next witness, I'm going to have my staff distribute the fiscal note on Senate Bill 34 that LSC has prepared, and to distribute that to every member. And is Mr. Keller here? He was here, but he had to leave. I do have a question. You can get back. I like that the fiscal note indicates LSC is unaware of Ohio-specific studies that were published in peer-reviewed academic journals, and as such does not have a reliable basis to estimate the indirect fiscal effect of the Alternative Energy Portfolio Standard repeal contained in Senate Bill 34. That's the last two sentences of the fiscal note. We have, over the holidays, secured the so-called Center for Resilience OSU study. When I say so-called, because you'll see shortly why it is so-called. It was commissioned by the Ohioans for an Advanced Energy Economy and performed at OSU. And in that study, which I don't know if it's peer-reviewed or not, but they very clearly show in that study that from 2008 through 2013, the renewables portfolio has resulted in a 0.43% increase in the cost of generation in Ohio. Now that's a very small number, but you just heard Mr. Martis say that wind is about 1% of Ohio generation. So if a 1% wind equals almost a 0.5% increase in generation cost, I want to furnish you all with that study and see if you can provide a better LSC fiscal impact of how much money we might potentially save by repealing these mandates, because, as I say, if wind accounts for 1% of generation and it has resulted in a 0.5% increase in generation in just 5 years, what's it going to be when it's 12.5% of total generation? And you might be able to massage your numbers and give